Look, I got a testimony. I gotta tell him what God did. I'm calling God the homie. He took me out of the mosh pit. I will contest the phony. Separate demons and God's kids. I gotta spread his word, so I'ma show you who the God is. The word is my weapon. I move like a general.
Hey, hello, everybody, and this is JJ, and welcome to this week's episode of Walk with Me. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. Hope you enjoy it. Hope it does something for you. If it does something for me, just to be able to talk about the goodness of God and the truthfulness of His Word. I thank you guys. Again, I can't thank you guys enough for just the success of the podcast so far. It's totally on you and on God. It has nothing to do with me. I just happen to be the guy with the microphone at the moment. Now, you guys could be listening to any other podcast. There are thousands of podcasts out there. Some of them telling you whatever you want to hear, and some of them just talking about something completely different. But you guys have chosen to download this podcast, and I really do appreciate it. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Today, this week, we are going to be talking about a little bit of a different subject. We're going to take a little bit of a different turn. I do have questions. If I have enough time, I will try to get into one of them before the end of this week's podcast. But what we're going to start off talking about today is a very kind of a sensitive subject, and you hear it all over the news. And this is not the first time this has had relevance. So where we're going to start today is in Proverbs chapter 22. And I'm just going to read one verse, but again, you know the rules of the podcast. Read the verse and then the verse or two above it, a verse or two below it, but preferably the whole chapter, because everything has to be taken in context. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and take a walk. In Proverbs 22 and 6, it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, so that when he's old, he will not depart from it." Now, does that always mean that you're going to make the same mistakes and the same decisions that your parents make? Absolutely not. This is not what that means. And this is not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about is, and I kind of find it disturbing that we kind of talk about this as a existing thing in some of our churches. I've heard people talk about something called a generational curse. And it's disturbing that people talk about it without addressing it. And so what are you saying, JJ? What am I saying? What am I saying is a child is going to grow up the way you train him to grow up. And he won't be exactly like you. He won't be, or she, they won't be, mirror image copies of you. But if you instill in them right and wrong and things of God and things of that nature, even if they backslide, like we talked about last week with the prodigal son, they know somewhere deep in the back of their minds and deep in their heart that there is a way, a place to go back to. There is a way to figure out where things went wrong in their lives. So they know to go back to where things made sense. And this is why we have people now going after the kids. If you haven't noticed it, I'm telling you, you should open your eyes. They're going after the kids. They started by taking prayer out of schools, and they say a separation of church and state. And in that void, they began to teach other things. And now it's coming full circle. And now they've inserted their own religion, teaching our kids at a very young age about things that are not appropriate to be taught to kids. But I'm not going to go into that. We're going to stay in the Bible. Train up a child in the way he'll go, and when he is old, he won't depart from it. Now, he didn't say, the Bible didn't say when he's in his 20s, he won't depart from it. The Bible didn't say when he's running the streets said he's not going to depart from me. Talking about when he's old, when he's mature. Now, I got to thinking about why that was very important. One of the biggest examples that we have for how you train a child and how it can totally destroy a nation's blessings and how it can totally change the course of history is when we were talking about when Israel came out of Egypt. Keep in mind now, Israel had been enslaved to Egypt for about 400 years at this point. So we had generations and generations and generations of people who were born, grew up, and died in the shackles of that slavery, in the shackles of that bondage, in the shackles of that sin and cultural depravity, as it were. So at the time where when the time came to pass, when Moses was bringing the people out of Egypt, they began to have a little bit of an issue. And I started talking about it in a previous podcast, and I didn't really want to go all the way into exactly where I was going with that. So in Numbers, and this is not just the first time this has happened. This is not the first time this happened. It happened as soon as they left Egypt. As soon as they saw a chariot, as soon as they saw opposition, they were ready to back down. Why? Because they had been taught that as children. If you see an Egyptian soldier, you back down. Those are your masters. If masters say something, I can't come home right now, you back down. You don't say anything. They've been trained this way. So, yeah, they were all hype and ready to have a revolution and ride off into glory. And then all of a sudden there was a little bit of opposition, and all that training that they had growing up came back to sort of bite them in the face. So now we get to where this thing grew into a constant murmuring. You had all the old folks that had been slaves all their lives. They're now certainly free. And they had the people that had taught when they were children how to behave in a slavery society, how to deal with the Egyptians who were their overlords, overseers, however you want to put that. Now, then we got to Numbers, where we got to where God had already delivered Israel from Egypt. God had already shown them miraculous things in that deliverance. God killed the armies of the Pharaoh. He had shown them plagues. He had shown them all sorts of things that should have woken some of the elders up to the fact that they were serving a God that was mightier than their past. They were serving a God that was bigger than the circumstances that they had been accustomed to. That the God that they served could do anything but fail them. That's where they should have been. And we went through an entire book of Exodus. And here we now in the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 32. This is not just the beginning part of Numbers. This is the 32nd chapter of Numbers. Now, what had happened? God had promised them a place. And that place where they were promised was 7 days walking distance from Egypt. 7 days. They could have gotten there in 7 days. A week of walking. And that's with the camels and all the slow moving animals and stopping to rest. And so it wasn't really that far. Now let's read Numbers 32. We're going to go from verse 9 to 13. I want you to pick up on something very, very, very important. Numbers 32. For when they went up into the valley of Eshcol and saw the land, they discouraged the heart of the children of Israel, that they should not go into the land that the Lord had already given them. And let's stop for a second. The Lord had already given them something, and they were telling the children of Israel, don't go and take it. Verse 10. And the Lord's anger was kindled at the same time as he sware, saying, surely none of the men that came up out of Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land that I swear unto Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, for they have not wholly followed me, save Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, and Joshua, the son of Nun, for they have wholly followed the Lord. And the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years, until that entire generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was consumed. Whoa. The people who were the adults in the room had an immature mindset when it came to the thing that God had promised them. God had swore it. He didn't just, when God speaks, it's not an idle thing. God doesn't waste words. God does not make small talk. God doesn't just, he's not like us. You know, I'll say things and not mean it all the time. God, yeah, yes, wife, I'll make sure I keep my socks off the floor. And at the moment, I might really mean it, and 12 seconds later, I really didn't mean it. That's not how God is. If God says something to you, he means it. But not only did he say this to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not only did he promise it, he swore it. That is a vow. That is something serious. That's when you look somebody dead in the eye and you promise, and you know in your heart you're going to do a thing. You vow that it will be done. You swear it'll be done. And this is the same God that just showed them all these miracles. All these miracles. The 10 plagues that, helped liberate Israel from Egypt. Everything that God had done for Israel up to that time, and people still had that slave mentality to where they could not go and accept God's promise. See, God doesn't want a group of people who was not going to follow him and serve him. And I know that sounds contrary to the way we teach it today in churches. Oh, God loves you, which is true. God does love you. God loves you. God died for you. He hung on the cross and he sacrificed his flesh for you. This is true. But if you're not going to make up in your mind that you are willing to accept the thing that God has already swore for you, God gets upset about this. And this is not to say this is a bad thing. Because if you really love somebody and you promised them a thing and they never believed you, wouldn't that make you angry? And I'm talking about something that you've already proven yourself over and over and over and over. I don't know if any one of you out there listening to this podcast has ever gone through that. But if you promised your child something, for those of you guys who have children, I don't have any myself, but I have my niece and my nephew who I call my data and my son. But if you have someone that you take care of someone like a child to you, and you promise them a thing, and you vow to them this thing you will do, wouldn't it disappoint you and anger you if they never believed you? Like, where have you been? What are you doing? What are you looking at? Who are you listening to that is convincing you that the promises I made to you that I've already shown what I can do is not real? Who are you listening to? And there's only one other source you could be listening to. Because the root of that fear, that disbelief, that rebellion figure is Satan. So that's the only other place you could be getting this information from. Well, wait a minute, JJ. Wait. You kind of made a leap there. Now, I understand. If you're saying that to yourself right now, I get it. I get it. But first of all, let's kind of dig into it a little bit. Who would tell someone that God is not going to honor their promises? It goes right back to the book of Genesis. Well, he says, God said, if I eat this fruit, I'm going to die. The devil said, if you eat this fruit, you will not die. That's where all this started. That's where all of this started. And we come here, and the same exact spirit of no is right here. God says, you shall go up and possess this land, and you got all these people with this slave mentality, this bondage mentality, sitting there saying, well, you will not go up, and we're going to die there. And these people are big, and we're just mosquitoes to them. And oh my, and humanistic, and we. And they stopped talking about God. They stopped talking about the glory of God. They stopped talking about the miracles of God. They stopped talking about the things that they know they have watched God do. And it was the adults that did it. I'm going to say this again. It was the adults that did it. And God saw that. And so everybody who was 20 and up, 20 years of age and up, could not go into the promised land. Except for Joshua, Caleb, because they were the only two who came back from that spy mission and said, bro, with God with us, we could totally do this. And that's what we're dealing with today. People would sit in church and listen to the word of God come across the pulpit and go right out into the world and say, we can't achieve blank because we are blank. Well, what's blank? Oh, it doesn't matter. Whatever that spirit of no, whatever that spirit of defeat, whatever that spirit of fear wants to put in there. Okay. Well, we can't be CEOs because we're fat. We can't be in a position of equality because our skin color is a certain thing. We can't get paid the same amount of money because of our born sexual gender. Now, all that is coming right back to the spirit of fear and the spirit of no. Meanwhile, God is telling you, you can do all things through me. God is telling you, if you want to shake drugs and alcohol, you can do it through me. If you want to be successful, you can do it through me. I have all these things promised unto you. I have all these things set aside for you. All you got to do is believe that I said I was going to do it. That's all you got to do. But you let someone tell you that you can't accomplish this. And they've gone now into telling our kids the same thing. They've taken the people who knew better, who have seen the works of God, they've taken those people completely out of the equation. Moses was taken completely out of the equation in this discussion. Moses had his own issues. He was done. He couldn't see the promise. He couldn't go into the promised land anyway because of that deal he did with the rock. And we'll talk about that at another podcast, because that has other implications. But they took Moses completely out of the equation. They took all the things that God had done completely out of the equation. The only one who was talking about the glory and the goodness of God was Joshua and Caleb. And for that reason, they were allowed to go into the promised land, even though they were above 20 at the time of the curse. So what are you teaching your kids? Is the point. Are you growing up? Are you still in that old mindset that they can't do this and they can't do that? Now, I'm not saying if you're 3'1" and 220 pounds that you're going to play basketball. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about what God has promised them. Do you even know what God has promised you? What God has promised me? What God has promised all of us? That we can do all things through Him. All you got to do is believe on Him. And all you got to do is take it to the Lord in prayer. I mean, these are basic things. Are we teaching this to our kids? I mean, we are quickly creating a lost generation. We're quickly getting to the point where we're going to have to wander in the desert for 40 years before we can go into the promised land. And that presents a whole new set of problems. Don't lose the generation. It's a war right now for these precious young people. I look at the church population and I see the church population growing older, but not being replenished so much from the younger generation. And it's not a great thing. It's not a good thing at all. And it's our fault. And I can tell you, God is watching that. Now, if you're not, and don't give me this whole, well, I'm not a perfect Christian. Listen, we are striving for perfection. And that was one of the questions that I had. It looks like I'm not going to be able to get to it this week, but I promise you out there, the one who asked me about being saved more than once, I'm going to answer that question next week. I promise. I may even upload a auxiliary podcast for you, just to make sure that we handle that question. But make sure when you're talking to your kids that you are countermanding that spirit of no out there, that negative spirit, that spirit of defeat, that spirit of despair, that spirit of confusion. It's your job, my job, our job to balance that. And I'm not just talking about this mealy mouth, quiet affirmation or encouragement. No. I'm talking about truth. Telling our kids the truth, telling these kids the truth of what's going on, telling each other the truth, reinforcing each other. Why do you think they don't want you to go to church? Why do you think they don't want you to talk about God? But they want you to talk about all these other things that they're putting on these kids these days. We're getting hit from it. We're getting hit with it left, right, and center. Why do you think that is? Why? Because they know if they can cancel out the next generation, they think they can win. And I know you say, well, JJ, we're in the last days and the world is going this way. Oh, yeah, I get it. But that doesn't mean that God has allowed us to give up the ground. that doesn't mean that God has allowed us to give up the promise. You know, Jesus said that in those days, woe be to children in those days. And I see it now. Children are in a really rough spot these days. And, you know, when we were growing up, everything was happy and yeah, we had some issues and, you know, some things we didn't like. We didn't like some of our parents telling us what to do and this and that. But now, man, if your kid didn't want to go to school, the government will step between you and your child before you can make them go to school. And then when they get to school, they get hit with all kinds of ungodly stuff. They get hit with all kinds of stuff. So it's your job to kind of wash that mind out when it comes back. And I hate to say it like that because that's what it ends up being. It's your job. You got to sit your kid down sometime and say, hey, listen, God has promised you some stuff. You may not understand it right now, but you will one day. God has promised you some stuff. God has put you in a position where you can be successful. You can live for him. And then when you die, you can go to heaven. That's what we need to tell our children. And wash all that nonsense that the world is pumping into their children, their brains right now. Wash all that out. Because we are in the fight that can determine if we wander in 40 years of wilderness or we can go into the promised land. Now, thank you guys for listening. I said watching because we're getting ready to I'm trying to work up the deal about going, you know, with the video, with the podcast. But thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for sharing. I see that you've been sharing and downloading it. I really do appreciate it. And I've seen a lot of questions come into the question box. And in case you didn't know what the questions were, the email is walkwithmebiblestudy@gmail.com. It's walkwithmebiblestudy@gmail.com. And I will most likely answer, because that question was a very serious question about being saved more than once. So I would definitely see about getting you a special edition question and answer podcast toward the end of this week. God bless you, love you, and let's keep walking.
Yeah. True. See, I do it for Jesus. Everything I've been doing, give me a reason. I got to spread all the words of a genius. Everybody need to know who the leader. See, I do it for Jesus. Everything I've been doing, give me a reason.